Shalom Nikulam. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to another of our English webinars. Throughout the last few years now, we've been offering every couple of weeks discussions and lectures and other things, sometimes virtually like this, sometimes in person at the Begin Center, but always available for you to watch on Zoom wherever you are. So we have an audience of both Israeli English speakers and diaspora Jews and others in the United States and Canada, the UK and elsewhere. So welcome everybody wherever you are. Today we're discussing something a little different from usual. Obviously, when we planned this event, we couldn't have known that it would be really in the midst of an extremely eventful period for Israel. Those of us here in Israel, most of us, I think, were glued to our TV screens yesterday with the return of Romy and Emily and Doron. And I think those in America and elsewhere will have been glued to their screens watching President Trump's inaugural speech an hour ago. We're here now with, as fans of Monty Python might know, we're here for something completely different. We're here to discuss I think, a cultural a renaissance, a cultural change, revolution maybe in Israel, an attempt to break through what had been in Israel very much a cultural monopoly by the for want of a better way of putting it, I guess the sort of broadly secular left of Israel, and the marginalizing of more right-wing voices, more religious voices inside Israeli culture, which goes back to the founding of the state and even before that. And we're going to discuss some of that. And I'm really delighted to have with us on this webinar the editorial team of the English edition of the journal that we're going to be discussing, Yehi. We have with us Yisro Meidad, who's a member of the Uri Tzvi Greenberg Center Executive Board after retiring as Information Resources Director at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. He volunteers as a research fellow here. He was previously a Knesset parliamentary aide for the legendary Geula Cohen. We also have with us Bat Nadiv Hakarmi, who's an American-Israeli writer, visual artist, and editor. She's the author of the book, The Love of Mortal Beings. Her work has appeared in many literary journals, including Poet Law, Poetry International, Ilanot Review, and Art Poetry Magazine. She previously headed the Hebrew Classics department at Toby Press and was a founding member of the editorial staff of Partial Answers, a journal of literature and the history of ideas. And last but by no means least, we're very fortunate to have with us Michael Weingrad, professor of Jewish literature, currently visiting professor at Hillsdale College. His novel, Eugene Nadelman, a novel about American Jews in the 1980s, written in the verse sonnet form of Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, was published just this fall. So to Yisrael and Bat Nadiv and Michael, thank you so much for being with us. Let's start with a question about the institution that made this journal possible, which is the Uri Tzvi Greenberg Center, or Beit Moreshet Uri Tzvi. Yisro Meidad, can you tell us, firstly, for those who don't know, and I'm sure there are some that don't, who was Uri Tzvi Greenberg, and why is it so important to have his Moreshet, his legacy, preserved and educated about?
Thank you for having me on. In very few short sentences. Uri Tzvi Greenberg, born in 1896 and died in 1981, was a poet. He was a journalist. He was a political activist. He was a member of the first Knesset. Most importantly, he was the most outstanding voice of national thinking in the pre-state period. He first championed the Chalutzim, the pioneers of the second and third Aliyot here in Israel, lecturing to them, writing about them. And then because of policy differences, similar to Jabotinsky. He moved off into a more strident, a more vibrant, anti-British and anti-Arab position. And that, touching on one of the themes that you already mentioned, led to him being ostracized. In fact, they refused to publish his work or to consider him in his stature as one of the greatest poets in Hebrew of the 20th century. He made a comeback, however, because in 1951, 52, his book in Hebrew, Rechovot HaNahar, the streets of the river, dealt with the Holocaust. And that sort of reunited him with the mainstream of Israelis who found his book absolutely amazing, dealing with that period of time. That, I think, in a nutshell, is who Uri Tzvi Greenberg was.
And as you say, he was ostracized because Israeli politics was and Zionist politics before that was so dominated by Mapai, by the labor movement, and those who were on the other side of the divide, on the revisionist side, were very much not allowed to take part in the cultural conversation. And so, where do you see what's the role of the center of Beit Moreshet Uri Tzvi today? Do you think?
Well, that, of course, I'll have to bring in the former member of Knesset, the late Geula Cohen. Most, if not all, of the members of the fighting undergrounds, the Irgun, and of course the Lehi, in the pre-state days, viewed him and his poetry of the 1930s as one of their charging moments in their cultural life and in being sent out to do battle as if under his command. And when Geula retired from the Knesset, a little bit forcefully, in fact, losing the elections in 1992, she turned around and immediately went to work on the cultural aspect of Israel society, established the Bet Uri Tzvi, as we call it for short, invited poets, songwriters, theater, movies, all sorts of cultural activities to be begun from a national, religious, right of center point of view. That's what the center had been doing early on and continues to do. And Yehi, the journal, is a natural outgrowth of providing platforms for people to express themselves freely.
Right. Okay. So Yehi was founded, I think, 5 years ago, 2019. And we now have this groundbreaking English edition with work translated into English. Bat Nadiv, I want to ask you about your involvement in this English edition and how you saw your contribution to it, and really how did it come about? How did this English language edition come about?
Yeah. So it's been such a long trip. Like we began this it's been a year and a half since we started this, and I was first approached by El Chai, who's kind of the artistic director at Beit Uri Tzvi, when I was still on maternity leave, and he was like, "Listen, we want to do an English anthology edition. Would you be interested in being involved?" And I'd known the center mostly for their art exhibitions.
Hmm.
They have extremely beautiful, cutting edge exhibitions by artists who don't tend to get mainstream coverage.
Hmm.
Many of them right wing,
Right.
many of them also featured in this edition. And I was like, this sounds really interesting. And I was on maternity leave, so I could also let myself go with it. I was like, okay, I'm in. And I think it was actually Michael who originally inaugurated the idea of an English version, wasn't it?
Yeah, although I originally approached El Chai and the Beit Ori Tzvi with a different idea. So what Yisrael just said about, and what you said in your opening remarks, Paul, about the marginalization of religious voices, of conservative voices, of sort of unofficial voices from cultural institutions. I come at this from my own perch in the United States, where I am a professor and a writer, and I've seen in many ways a far more extreme, not even a marginalization, but
Right.
total ideological capture of many of our cultural and educational institutions in the United
Canceling.
States.
Canceling.
Yes, yes, and something that people are at, we've seen where this leads over the last year with the kind of madness and violence on American college campuses and this kind of total moral collapse that has been going on for quite a while. In many ways, the exclusion of Jewish writers, Jewish thinkers, Jewish speakers from these institutions was preceded some years ago by the exclusion of anyone who might be identified as conservative.
Right.
So I was kicking around the idea and continue to of starting some kind of literary journal that would be not partisan or party line, but would just simply be open and friendly to people on the right. I approached the Beit Ori Tzvi because I had the idea of translating material from this extraordinary literary magazine, this
Mm.
center of vibrant art and poetry and literary culture. Yehi, with the website alone is just a gorgeous feat of design. So I thought I wanted to essentially poach their material for something that I was considering. They turned it around and extended the invitation to me. Said, what if we created a special issue in English translation that would draw from our extant first four issues and give a selection for English language readers of what we do? And I said, great, sign me up.
So maybe I can ask both of you, Batnadev and Michael, Batnadev first, maybe how did you choose which pieces to publish, which to translate, who translated it, how easy was it to translate? My assumption, not ever having done translation before, my assumption is that poetry would be particularly difficult to translate.
Yeah. So we had several meetings about choosing, and we all were going through all of the editions and sort of choosing our favorites. And I think there was a very clear pattern. Like El Chai, it was very important for him to include certain political pieces, even though I felt that they wouldn't translate well into English. I feel like my drive was primarily aesthetic. What
Mm.
drew me to Yehi was that I felt it was a very Jewish poetry. And when I say Jewish, I mean that Agnon writes about how he sees his writing as almost a preservation of the original language because he's keeping the midrashic undertones that were getting lost in modern Hebrew. And I felt like Yehi was one of the only places where I still saw that being done.
Mm.
And that's what I was looking for. I was looking for those poems that borderline can't be translated because they are so, I'm not going to say culturally specific, but they are very, very intertextual.
Right. The
And that was
Hebrew is
kind of my
intrinsic to
direction.
the poetry. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I was really looking for that. And Michael, you come in with what you were looking for because we had like these kind of three voices that we were looking at, and then we kind of had to find a way to bring it together.
Yeah, so I was much more open to giving the kind of uh, very diverse but right end of the political spectrum in many of the poems. But for all of the differences between Batnadiv and I, it was wonderful working together
Yeah.
because we both had a real conviction in the importance of creating in translation great poems that would be powerful in English.
Yeah.
And we were both sensitive to the way in which the context of a different language can alter the meaning. So we wanted to set these poems up for success. In some cases, there were extremely strong poems in the original Hebrew that we just felt would lose too much in translation. In so many other instances, we found that poems gain new and surprising things in English
Mm.
translation. So we put out a call for translators, an open call, and some extremely experienced and wonderful, I'll call them old hands, although not necessarily old, joined the call, as well as some people who were approaching translation relatively recently, and and we work with them to varying degrees to
We tried
hammer
to
these.
match up the poems with kind of the strengths of the translators that we were seeing. So we were like, if we saw a translator that was very good on form, we would try to give them a poem that had a strict form. If we saw someone who really knew how to deal with sources, we would give them one of those poems that were borderline not translatable and say, okay, what could you do with this? And sometimes we got beautiful surprises in poems that we weren't sure we could translate, and the translators came up with incredible solutions that we didn't think of originally.
So, for instance, there's a wonderful poem early on in the collection by Yossi Suede that plays really wonderfully with internet language, with sales and advertising language, but to explore different aspects of Jewish nationhood. And the translator Joe Schwartz just did a wonderful job. He really has an ear for both the Jewish and the Zionist elements of the poem and the way in which it's bringing in a kind of BuzzFeed discourse. But another example where Batnadiv and I were both happily stunned was a poem that entirely turns on the different meanings of the Hebrew word Hasidah, which can be, on the one hand, a beautiful white-winged bird. On the other hand, it can be it's the female of Hasid, and someone who is pious and devoted. And we both looked at this poem and we said, we want this for the collection if at all
That was my
possible. But
favorite poem, one of my favorite. I was like, I really want this in. And we're like, but can it be translated?
we really didn't think so, and we kind of gave it to we sort of sent it as almost an impossible task to a translator who,
Deborah Greatman.
yeah, it was Deborah Greneman just did a glorious job
Beautiful.
with it, partly by not translating that one term. She left it in the Hebrew original,
Right.
and build her translation around it. So there were it was a whole variety of different approaches.
Yeah. Before we go on, I do want to just pay tribute to Elchai Salomon, who's been mentioned in passing, but it's important that we make sure everyone's aware that Elchai, who couldn't be with us for this webinar, but is very much the driving force behind Yehi, and I think it's important that everyone knows who he is. Let's before we go on to I want to ask about the visual arts as well, but before we get onto that, can you just give an example? Obviously, our audience will not be necessarily familiar with the magazine. When we talk about more religious, more conservative or right of center voices, what kind of topics, what kind of subjects are covered in these poems, which maybe would be too, I don't know, to be seen as too controversial or just too politically right wing or whatever for more mainstream publications? Can you just give us an example?
Well, first of all, Yehi, I think, is the first publication to dedicate an entire issue to the disengagement and its impact on Israeli society. And the third edition is dedicated towards that. And
Right.
it's poems by people who experienced it, poems by really just exploring the devastation of the people who were cleared out. And I don't think anyone else has done that.
Right.
So
We're
that's
talking about the
one,
disengagement from Gaza in 2005. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
which took on a completely different resonance after October 7th. I mean, when we started this, it was before, and then suddenly we have all these poems, and we're like, oh my God, they're reading very, very differently now. We even had one of our translators withdraw because he was like nervous about how current it suddenly became.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. So that's an example. And the fourth edition is called Haredim, and it's just Haredi voices. And that's also, it's one of the only publications I've seen. You get your token Haredi, what they call the Haredi Mahmad, the pet Haredi. in different publications, but this was the only place that I felt tried to enter the Haredi world, try to see it from their own perspective and just say, okay, go for it and use your own aesthetics, use your own concerns, show us what you want, and kind of created a space for the society to speak outwards while still maintaining its own world. And that I thought was extraordinary and very, very important.
Just out of interest, was that decision, was that in any way, was that a difficult decision in any way? I'm just thinking that the Haredi voice, although definitely clearly to me fits into the definition of
Marginalized.
marginalized, um, certainly in terms of Israeli culture. But it's clearly it's not coming from the same place as Uri Tzvi or people talking about the Hitnat or or you know the sort of Dati Leumi world, right? So was that a difficult decision, or it was just sort of made sense in the context of this sort of opening up that Michael was talking about, this open space?
If I could jump in here on that,
Please.
Besides Uri Tzvi Grimberg himself coming from a very, very Haredi background himself, his own personal history, the Uri Tzvi Grimberg Center or house has for many years opened up its doors to the Haredi artistic element, whether it's poetry, whether it's, I wouldn't say sculpture, but painting and art and other visuals, which fit into Yehi, that special edition that Bat Nadiv had mentioned, and in translation. And when I hearing the conversation now in the webinar, when we say religious, we mean national religious, or what we call modern Orthodox, and Haredim.
Okay.
And I think it's one of the few journals to give weight and value to input of artistic creations, both verbal and visual, from the Haredi community. And at events at the Uri Tzvi Grimberg House, you will see a lot of Haredi artists present and engaging and being involved, which I think is a very good contribution.
Right.
I agree. And I would also say that the response to the sense of cultural marginalization can move in one of two directions. You can go for more of a kind of niche, closed environment that tries to circle the wagons. But Yehi, from the start, has seemed to me to come entirely out of a sense of positive excitement and creativity and expanding of the bandwidth rather than an attempt to just sit on one little portion of it. And I think that's reflected in the magazine and in the selections that we chose for the English language issue. It's really unpredictable.
I mean, this is, you say right wing and you begin imagining something close, but it's not that. This is a journal that has Hebrew and Arabic side by side. It has left wing voices, and that's what I love about it. It is really trying to preserve the diversity and present the diversity of Israeli society. And I think it's the only literary journal around that's doing that. I find that so much of what you get on the Israeli literary scene is like this tiny sliver of Israeli society. And you're like, but this isn't us. This isn't the people we see. And when you open up Yehi, is no, this is us. And look at it. There's everybody here.
Wow.
And that to me was the most beautiful part about it. And I think that was a large part of Michael and mine selection process is we really wanted to get that full voice and like, yes, choose that one off over there and that one off over there and say, look, this is all here. This is not like some conservative stereotype.
Sure. As Michael intimated earlier, I think I'm sure many of our American listeners will be recognizing the sort of the tendency in the American Academy, of course, but also things like Hollywood and and just the broader mainstream American cultural scene, which I think for very different reasons and perhaps in different ways, and maybe even more extreme ways, as Michael said in recent years, is very much dominated by one side of the spectrum and is the opposite of what you're saying, but because it is closed and it is saying there are the voices we want to hear and the voices we don't. And I think that's what's beautiful, that what you're talking about here is something so directly contrary to that. Let's talk a little about the visual art, because that's very prominent
Yeah.
in the English edition that I've seen, and I think probably more broadly in Yehi. What role does that play in Yehi? How was that select, and how did you choose the ones for the
Right.
English edition?
So I come as a visual artist, and as I said, I first met Beit Uri Tzvi as a gallery, and that's how I knew it. And El Chai is also a visual artist, and he's the curator of the gallery.
Hmm.
So it's very much there, not as an addition, not as a flourish, but as part of this cultural thing that's being shown. And I would say the same thing about, what we're saying about the poetry is also going on in the art. There's a lot of the marginalized voices. I mean, Haredi art is mostly treated as a joke in the Israeli art scene. Again, unless it's the Khaledi Mahmad, we'll bring in one pet artist that will show. But there's been statements that there's no such thing as right-wing art. All right-wing art is dogmatic. And then you have Yehi and Yehi saying, let's look at this art. Let's look at what it's doing. And some of it's dogmatic and some of it is not. And like with the poetry, I mean, what's amazing about the poetry there is they're not afraid to offend everybody, including their own base. Like we were talking about Svia Margalit's Bourgeoisie, which we both loved. But it's a poem that could offend everybody because it's so unexpected and so out of the box that it could be read as criticizing every single segment of Israeli society. And I feel like the same thing often happens with the art. Like some of it is, okay, this is about the disengagement. This is about, and then there's the art that just can't be defined. Actually, you know what? If I can, I'm going to share something with you. I'm going to go
Well,
down.
while you look at that, I'll also say again, coming from the American perspective, where I live in a world where there seem to be a million different literary magazines that no one reads, and they all feel sterile and predictable, uh, overly politicized, thin. Uh, One of the things that really drew me to Yahi was that the sense that we get from a poem like Bourgeoisie or Bourganut from Tzvia Margaliot, that it wakes you up. It is
It
full
shocks
spectrum.
you.
It shocks you. It's full spectrum. Not shocking in the sense of épate les bourgeois, but shocking in the sense that it is a statement that matters. It's something that you think about. It doesn't give you a prepackaged message. It is aesthetically powerful. It stays with you. It's worth reading.
Yeah. And if I can, I'm going to just share some of the visual
Please.
art so I can discuss some of it. Um, Wait, I'm actually
Yeah.
not able to share. I'm trying to.
Should be able to now.
Let me try again.
Again, while you do that, I also
Yeah.
want to say that even if you don't know Hebrew, you'll see that the He website has all kinds of visual material on it. You can click through and see incredible art and videos. Even the page design is beautiful, but also, and I'll put this up in the chat if I may. But I'll also put up the little taster page that we have for the English language issue, where again you can see some art and some examples from the issue.
So I'm just sharing one of the pieces. There's so much art in here. This is by Ilan Baruch, who's actually a religious artist who does get some acceptance within the Israeli art establishment, but it's always kind of borderline. And, it's very classical. He's very trained. And yet he's also doing something interesting because here he is with this super realistic, beautiful atelier style painting of an Arab laborer. And then side by side, the same style painting of an Israeli settler. And he does this again and again and again. And it's like, on the one hand, he's showing the people who you don't see. And
Yeah.
on the other hand, he keeps breaking down these binaries. And I think a lot of the poems do it too. I mean, these are poems that on the one hand are talking about the experience of living in a settlement, and yet on the other hand, keep raising how close we are, how these lines that divide are very, very shaky and they're not as clear cut as you think. And I feel like both the visual art and the poetry do this. They kind of are anti-binary. They want you to think, they want you to look, and they're
Mm,
looking and they're thinking as they go along. I'm
right.
gonna, how do I stop sharing? Stop sharing.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Here we go.
Great. That was great. No, that was really great. And I Michael, I do want I want to take you up on what your offer to share in the chat, because I want our viewers to be able to know how they can access the excellent how they can access the website. So you can now see that in the chat. For those who are watching this in the recording, which will be up on YouTube, we'll make sure that the link is in the description below the video. In about 10 minutes, I want to go to questions from our audience. So please do think of some questions to put to our panel. Before we get to those questions, though, let me ask, what were some of the challenges that you encountered in this process of creating this English edition? Beyond the obvious one of just that, it's not easy to translate some of this stuff.
I think
A lot of
October
those feel
7th.
like opportunities.
Yeah.
Mm,
So the what gets found in translation rather than what gets lost. There were the post October 7th political shifts. We actually had not one, but
Two.
two translators, both of whom I don't think it's accidental that they're young products of elite American universities, not wanting their names associated with the poems, and so we had to sever the we had to agree to disagree and sever the relationship there.
And this
Uh,
was after it had gone through a full editorial back and forth, back and
oh,
forth.
wow.
Yeah, we had to
so
retranslate them
Oh my God.
or just do
So,
something.
but
Yeah.
that's again, that is what the literary landscape looks like now. To my dismay, at the same time, I think what we've been seeing in recent months is a real determination, also in diaspora among
Mm.
growing numbers of American Jews uh, to resist that, to stand up, to create new venues, to create spaces where we can speak loudly, where we are welcome. And I think he is part of is part of that welling up of justified outrage and a sense of building new things and new institutions and creating new connections. So that's very good to see.
I would say for me, like the biggest challenge, considering that it's an anthology issue, was how to create a flow, how to make it work. And like that was my big challenge. That was kind of, I took it on myself and was like, okay, how do we get a sequencing here? How do we fit in the visual art in a way that is not a decoration, but kind of comments on the poems?
Yeah.
And that to me was it was kind of the end part, and it was also the most meaningful part because that was when it kind of came together as its own work rather than just be a collection of different translations.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And where do you see this project going forward? Are we going to see more English? Because I think that, one of the reasons why we wanted to do this event was this webinar was because we wanted the English speaking Jewish world to be more aware of Yehi, of Beit Uri Tzvi, of Uri Tzvi himself, and this whole issue of these marginalized voices and the importance of giving them exposure. So where do you think we can go from here with this?
I
First,
Well,
think
I just wanted to point out that the edition ends with two translations of Uri Tzvi that have not poems that have not been seen
Right.
or in English. So I
That's
think
amazing.
in terms of getting to know Uri Tzvi, and it was Michael who did I think the really important one, which is about the one about the Hebron massacre,
Yeah.
which also marks kind of Uri Tzvi's turning point. I mean, it was after the Hebron massacre that he really turned completely to the revisionist, and
Mm.
you kind of see it as this very seminal poem. And after October 7th, I remember I was looking over Michael's translation. I was like, someone's speaking what we're all
I
feeling.
I have to say, I read it, and I couldn't read it without thinking of October 7th.
Yeah.
It was that it felt absolutely contemporary.
Yeah.
As in many cases, Orit Zvi gives us the language we need, particularly in a case so extreme. And I can't turn anywhere else than him.
Hmm.
I definitely would like to see the word get out about the issue. I'm going to post two more links, which are how people can obtain either a digital or a physical copy. But I think in Israel, it's really a matter of getting the word out because Israelis understand the intertwining of culture, literature, and lived experience. I think these are seen much more separate spheres in the American context. And so I think or I at least feel like I'm going through a little bit of a process now of trying to bring the issue and bring these sorts of projects in front of uh, institutions and leaders who are very, very serious about ideas. They're very, very serious about policy. They're very, very serious about politics, and don't always see the extent to which literature, the arts, culture fits into that.
That's great.
As a personal a point of view, when I first came into the Beitar Zionist youth movement, I became an editor of a semi-literary journal called Hakotz, The Thorn. That was back in 1965. So it was a pleasure for me to, even on the sidelines, get involved in some sort of an editorial process in helping Yehi in this English translation volume move along. But as a general remark, when people know that their work is appreciated, that their work can appear in a more, I'd even say, prestigious platform than they previously thought, more works of art, photographs, visual arts, poetry, even perhaps short plays or whatever will begin to develop. And that's a major contribution that Yehi could make, both in English and, of course, in its original Hebrew intention on Israel's current cultural scene.
Thank you very much. I want to ask our audience to start writing questions into the Q&A, because I want to make sure that our panelists don't just get questions from me, but also from you. So please do that. Let me ask while we're waiting for those questions, what some of the if there were unexpected pleasures in putting this together, things you weren't necessarily expecting to experience in creating this.
For me, certainly working with my colleagues and also getting to know better some of the poets and the artists. The extraordinary artistic work of Miriam Billner, for instance.
Yeah.
Her work in fabric. I don't know if we can pull that up right now.
Yeah,
but
here, I'll share it. I'll share it.
Okay.
I mean, Miriam is
but
primarily a comics artist, but we couldn't include her comics because they were all in Hebrew and her handwriting is so much a part of it. But we could share her fabric art. One moment, I'm gonna.
At the same time, I recently translated a graphic novel by the Israeli cartoonist Shai Charka from Hebrew into English and organized an international Zoom event with Israeli graphic artists and comic book artists. And so I invited Miriam to participate, and she was wonderful because her graphic novels are like nothing else that I think anyone has ever seen. These wild messianic dystopian visions of a future Israel are absolutely wonderful. So for me, getting to know, right, this is the work
This
I was
is her
particularly
piece about the
thinking of.
disengagement. The piece does, I mean, there's no
The
one.
Eyes of the Lion of Judah. and it's a work in fabric, and
I'm going to show
she
another
does
one
many.
called Messiah, and only Miriam could embroider the Messiah thus. Like a
Uh,
Wow.
yeah.
so um, so yeah, so that making those connections has been wonderful, and it was tremendously meaningful when we had a launch event at the Ori Tzvi house, when, for instance, Svia Margaliot, who's well known for giving extraordinary spoken word poetry performances in Hebrew, gave one in English that responded to the really awful yet fashionable politics of the West regarding post October 7th. And it was powerful and beautiful and eloquent, and a wonderfully administered smack in the face.
Very nice. The best kind of smack in the face. Um, very good. I'm gonna. Oh, we have a question here from Alana Rubin that I'm going to put to you, which is, what will it take for the mainstream Israeli art scene to begin to integrate Jewish religious themes and subjects, and could October 7th contribute to a shift?
That's a big one.
And it's just before you answer, I mean, it's interesting because unlike the situation in the United States, which has a lot of quite contemporary sources, I think. Um, in Israel, we're talking about something which goes all the way back to the founding of the state and even beyond, and the split in the Zionist movement, and the the very personal animus between Ben Gurion and Begin, and all this kind of stuff, which some of our audience will be aware of. But you could make the case that today these things are less relevant, and certainly in Israeli politics itself, especially with the right being so dominant in Israeli politics for most of the last 30 years or so, that wouldn't be wouldn't have such a strong hold over the culture anymore. So maybe I'm just throwing that into the question. If you can concentrate on her question, but if you want to also take on mine as well.
It's a big question. I mean, I do think that the strongholds of kind of the establishment remain very left and very secular. But there has been a move towards the periphery and in the art scene as well. Like there's been Studio of Her Own, which really began mainstreaming religious women's art. Miriam Wilner is part of it, so am I. And I feel like that was part of this whole movement. They ended up having a retrospective exhibition in Ben Gurion University and the Mishkan Omanut. So there are these kind of, I guess, slipstreams coming in from the sides, and they've been gaining force. And I do think that there's also been, and you see it a lot happening with music. I mean, at this point, I feel like the music scene is really dominated by Mizrahi music that
Yeah,
has very strong religious overtone. And
yeah,
that's the pop music of Israel now. So the
right.
question is if it can move out of being the pop music or the pop culture and also begin to be taken seriously. And I feel like it's starting to happen, but I'm not sure when it's going to actually happen. I think it's like a lot of small movements that are coming together, that are gaining force. And it could be October 7th will change things. I don't know. I feel like the earthquake of October 7th is still happening. It's very
Right.
hard to know how it's going to play out.
Right. Yeah, the tremors are still being felt and will be for a
Yeah.
while. Yeah, very much so. Um, yeah.
If I may add
Yeah,
something
Yisrael, I
on
was going to
that,
ask. Yeah, please.
I think outside of Israel, people must understand that this clash of secular versus religious, Ashkenazi versus Sephardi slash Mizrahi,
Mhm.
these are things that still go on. And in a certain sense, culture, art, and literature play a role in defining the identity
Yeah.
of the justifying identity of political positions. And therefore, outside voices or contrarian voices or opposing voices are kept out as much as possible.
Mm.
When I mentioned way before on Uri Tzvi Greenberg, I'll add just something. The largest publishing houses throughout the years of the mandate and into the 60s were all connected with political parties.
Right.
Sifriyat Poalim of Mapam, Am Oved of Mapai, and Shulkin to a certain extent of Haaretz, which was like the Middle German Zionists and stuff like that. And these things are feared if they break down because I'm seeking to justify whom I am, my identity, my political view through my art. And I won't allow anybody else to invade the territory.
Hmm.
And
I will
in
say
that
that the
sense,
Jerusalem
Alana's
art
question.
scene,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry.
Yeah,
Well, in
Mike,
that sense,
Michael.
Alana's question, I didn't want to answer it because coming from an outside of Israel perspective, but I do think that we may see parallel movements that can perhaps fructify each other mutually with things that are going on again in the United States, with a sense of that what Yisrael describes as part of the cultural history of Israel having been uh, actualized in the United States with a kind of ideological political capture that on the other hand isn't honest about what it is in many of our institutions. But as people are looking for alternatives, are looking to build new places that are more open, more vibrant, less straitjacketed, and that includes in political senses, that includes in the United States, we're seeing a kind of real continuing growth of, for instance, Catholic and Christian literature, journals like the Catholic journal Dappled Things, which is devoted to really wonderful creative writing, conservatives trying to work out what their relationship with culture is, and even wonderful new poetry venues that are just simply trying to adhere to aesthetic rather than purely ideological standards. I think of an example like the new online poetry journal, New Verse Review. So I think there are places for Jews and Jewish creators to join these, to create their own vessels for this new sense of energy and a kind of just final disgust with what we've been given so far.
Hmm.
I think also the marginalization of Jewish writers that's happening now in the English scene is pushing, I mean, it's pushing some Jewish writers underground where they're like, okay, I'm not going to write where I'm from and I'm not going to say what I'm doing. I won't publish Jewish content. But then you have other people saying, you know what? Forget it. Like I'm looking for other venues, and you have all these small venues that are popping up. You know, there's Judith Magazine, there's the Writing on the Wall that just published its first folio version of Balagan, and like there's this feeling of kind of we've given up on the mainstream. We want to be the opposition, kind of let's let our voice out there, and I think that that's for me. That's kind of what was the most meaningful part of this because it did change as we were working on it. You know, it started as, oh, this is a cool literary project, and then it became as this is a very important literary project, especially now, like
Hmm.
getting these voices out there now, saying these things now, opening up this venue now felt very, very important where so many voices were being completely silenced
Hmm.
and openly this time, not just beneath the surface.
Yeah. So another question, which is it's a little bit different. I wonder how much, really don't know the answer to this, so I'm interested to know what you all think. How much of the dominance, or rather, how much of the relative scarcity of, say, religious voices in Israeli culture is also because in the religious world it's just less, it's sort of less common for people to express themselves through a cultural medium rather than through a more specifically, for a sort of for a mass market, so to speak, rather than just for a religious, if you're going to write religious verse, then you would write it for your community. Maybe wouldn't want to write it for the wider Israeli public. Is that something that happens, or is that not really part of the story?
I think it's a chicken and an egg. You
Mm.
know, it's if you know that the stuff you're interested in doing nobody wants to see and nobody wants to hear,
Right.
then you don't even try. Like I remember when I was interested in going into art, people were like, "Don't go to Bezalel. Like nobody's
Mm.
going to be interested in what you do. Try something else." And I've heard this from many religious artists. It's kind of
Mm.
you go in knowing that you're going to be taking a marginal position, or you try to come in from the side originally because you don't think that there's going to be any place. But I do think that there is something true in that, like, even when this was created, and this is on a high level, it was very hard to get people to really look at it. Like the people who we thought would be the most interested in Yehi were not jumping on the fact that there was this very high level um, literary journal with art, because it's almost like we've seeded we've seeded culture, and
Right.
we're more into ideas, and that I think is an issue and it's a problem, and the
And because they don't
audience in some ways
understand,
needs to be created.
and because they don't understand what Michael said earlier, which is
Yeah,
that the ideas are downstream from culture, right?
yeah,
And at the same time, the models that have been offered by secular cultural institutions are very often quite
yeah,
corrupt and horrible. People are right to be wary about
yeah,
them. So as it's also incumbent upon perhaps not traditionally religious creators to be much deeper and more deliberate about how they understand the beautiful in relation to the good and the true. They do belong together, and the ways in which they relate can be complicated, but they do have to shore each other up, and that's something that again the educational and artistic and cultural institutions in certainly in the United States have been really derelict, either not answering or giving us very destructive answers. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Being older than most of the people in this webinar, I just want to point out that Yehi is not unique in the sense that it is trying to do what it's doing, what all of us have been describing here. I was on the board of Nikuda, which was a monthly that was published by the Yesha Council, that began to develop also literature and art. Tzipi Luria and other people that began to come out uh, of the society, which was to the other side of the secular society. It's a long time in coming, but I think that Yehi, of course, is an outstanding example of, given the space, given the encouragement, giving the platform, we can really see the production of literature, art, and visuals that do justice not only on its aesthetic level and its professional level, but also on the fact that we are expressing the ideas and the reality and the experiences of a very large community in Israel.
and
Right.
I will say, going back to Alana's question, like I've been thinking about it, um, and I feel like even the mainstream is beginning to realize this, like the fact that Bezalel opened Oman, which is its Haredi kind of chapter to help Haredi artists. I think it does show that the mainstream is beginning to realize that we need all these voices if we're gonna have a real and vibrant art here.
That's
So
great. I was actually going to ask because I remember hearing about Bezalel, and I actually know some religious people that are enrolled in Bezalel, and I know that they bring religion into their work. But I'm wondering about some of the institutions that some of our audience will know, whether because they live here or because they've visited Israel many times. To what extent are institutions like the Israel Museum or Tel Aviv Museum of Art, to what extent are they open to these different voices, or are they completely in the American terminology that Michael mentioned earlier, captured? I mean, I don't know the answer to that because I'm not in that world, but I'm interested in what you think about Nadiv.
I don't think I would be able to answer that, even though I've visited um, the Israel Museum many, many times, having a daughter who works there, actually. But I've seen very, very little art reflected or reflecting the communities which we're talking about here. It's a very, very difficult process to make the jump into such a ostentatious, if that's the word I could use, area and space and location. I don't think that they will be very open to allowing the voices and the products that we're talking about into their hallowed halls.
Any other responses to that?
I feel like this is going off topic but I feel like that's the top of the totem pole and it begins much, much lower. For a gallery to get government funding, it needs to show a certain list of artists who are considered mina minyan. So what it ends up doing is creating a closed circle because any gallery that wants funding is always going to be showing the same artists. And then these artists might not come unless they bring their friends. And so what ends up happening is someone who's not mina minyan has a very, very, very hard time breaking in. And even spaces that might originally be started for people who are outside of the minyan, if at some point they want to get recognized, they need to begin bringing in these artists. And so you're always going to end up seeing the same things. I don't know if it works the same way in poetry, but I wouldn't be surprised. Usually, it's a small pond.
Yeah.
And so the big fish watch out for each other. That's
okay. That was a bit of a digression, but it was actually important because I think for many of us, including myself, but I think I'm sure I speak for others, really don't know this world. So I think that was a really useful information. Okay. What I think we'll do, we're approaching the hour mark. So I want to thank Yisro Medad and Bat Nadiv Karmi and Michael Weingrad very much for their time and for agreeing to do this and for contributing so much, not just this conversation, but for the work they put in creating this remarkable issue of this remarkable journal. Please do check it out. The links are there in the chat, thanks to Michael's work earlier in putting them in there. As I said, if you're watching on YouTube, we're going to put all the links that are in the chat now into the description, so you can just look below the video and you'll see them there. I'm entering my email here, so you can email me. Firstly, if you're not on my mailing list and want to be and get information about our English events, both webinars and live, paulg@beguncentre.org.il. Please do drop me an email. But also, if you want to email me to get any information about Yehi, then please do, and I will forward you to one of our wonderful panelists here. So check it out. Also, learn more about Uri Tzvi Greenberg, fascinating and important figure in Israeli culture and Israeli history.
One of the greatest modern Hebrew poets. So just
there you have
it. Literary pleasure. It's worth reading him.
There you have it. And as I said, I confess I'm not familiar enough, not as familiar as I should be with his work. I was really blown away by the two translations of his work in the Yehi edition, the English edition. So thank you again. I wish everyone a good evening, a good afternoon if you're in the North America watching this, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. Bye.